Ladies and gentlemen, dear supporters and friends of Progress Foundation, let me welcome you all on behalf of our Board of Trustees and on behalf of our US sister institute, the American Institute for Economic Research, to our 55th Economic Conference. A special welcome goes to our two speakers, Professor Charles Goodhart and Professor Ernst Baltensberger, to Mark Ditley, who will chair the discussion, as well as to Alexandra Janssen and Ivan Adamovic, who will join the two speakers in the panel discussion. And I feel honored that the President of the Swiss National Bank, Thomas Jordan, has joined the audience to follow the presentations of our speakers. Let's give all of them a big hand. You got CVs of the speakers with the invitation, you find them on your seats. I was puzzled when I got more than one friendly but still critical remark that our speakers are over 80 years old. My answer was threefold. First of all, we do not discriminate neither against nor in favor of characteristics which have absolutely nothing to do with the topics of our conference. So we do not apply quotas, not for gender, not for race, and not for age, to mention just a few. Second, personal experience might explain my astonishment. When I joined the Board of Trustees of Progress Foundation over 30 years ago, I suggested an age limit of 75 for the trustees, as it was fashionable and became common at that time in Europe. The US trustees on the board protested vividly and told me that this ageism would be unacceptable and against the American Constitution. The oldest board member at that time was one US trustee around the age of 70. He left our board 3 years ago at the age of 99, and he was a most valuable and respected trustee all the time. The older I get, the better I understand my American fellows. Third, and above all, experience matters. That is most relevant for today's topic, inflation. Until the recent acceleration, annual inflation in Switzerland has never exceeded 2% since 1993. Thus, the 60% or so of the population who are younger than 50 have hardly faced inflation in their adulthood. And to remember the early 1970s with inflation rates of 5, 6 and once almost 12%, one has to be over 70 years of age. Die Wahl unseres heutigen Themas, Are Central Banks Causing Inflation, lag also auf der Hand, nicht nur weil Geld- und Währungsfragen im Zentrum der Interessen unseres Gründers E.C. Harwood standen. Inflation ist heute für die überwiegende Mehrheit der Bevölkerung ein neues Phänomen. Und sie wird, diese Prognose wage ich, nicht so schnell verschwinden. Sie ist klebrig. Eine Befragung des IWP Luzern und des IFO München zeigt für Westeuropa und die USA für 2023 eine Inflationserwartung von gut 5%, mittelfristig, also für 2026, eine von ungefähr 2,6%, aber für Südeuropa sind die Erwartungen deutlich höher, für Osteuropa sogar 2,5 Mal so hoch, weit entfernt von den 2%, die gemeinhin als Preisstabilität gelten. Nur für die Schweiz liegen die Erwartungen für 2026 bei 1,7%. Spürbare Entspannung sähe anders aus. Welche Verantwortung tragen die Notenbanken für diese Zahlen? Dass sie Verantwortung tragen, ist offensichtlich. Preisstabilität ist ihr oberstes Ziel oder müsste es sein. Man kann fragen, ob die Notenbanken technisch nicht in der Lage waren, das Keimen der Inflation im Frühstadium zu erkennen und zu stoppen. Diese Frage kann man verneinen. In der These Milton Friedmans, monetäre Kontraktion sei sowohl notwendig als auch hinreichend, um die Inflation zu bremsen, steckt wohl weiterhin viel Richtiges. Wenn es aber nicht am Können liegt, liegt es am Wollen. Und das trifft zumindest insofern zu, als den Geldbehörden von der Politik alle möglichen Ziele auferlegt wurden, die einige Notenbanken, nicht die schweizerische, willfährig akzeptiert haben. Wer neben der Geldwertstabilität nicht nur die Konjunktur beachten muss, sondern die Börse, den Zusammenhalt der EU, das Klima, Stichwort Green New Deal, den Weltfrieden, die soziale Gerechtigkeit, verliert den Fokus. Zum Teil stecken die Notenbanken aber auch in wahren Dilemmas. Sie gefährden mit einer restriktiven Politik die Finanzmarktstabilität, ohne die Geldwertstabilität bedeutungslos wird, und sie gefährden mit Zinserhöhungen die vielen, auch als Folge der überexpansiven Geldpolitik völlig überschuldeten Staaten. Bei solchen Gratwanderungen kann man eigentlich fast nur abstürzen. Die Frage ist nur, auf welche Seite. Unser Ablauf ist wie gewohnt. Zuerst spricht unser englischsprachiger Gast, Professor Goodhart. Darauf folgt Professor Baltensberger auf Deutsch, je 20 Minuten. Dann übernimmt Mark Dietli und fordert zusammen mit Alexandra Jansen und Ivan Adamovic die beiden Referenten etwas heraus, changierend zwischen Deutsch und Englisch. Die Diskussion sollte um 5, spätestens 10 nach 1 fertig sein, weil ich noch 2, 3 abschließende Bemerkungen zu machen habe. Und damit, Charles Goodhart, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here. Though I must say, when I came into Zurich, I discovered I didn't know what had happened to the Bahnhof, and find it very difficult to find my way around a newly built Zurich. It's made a lot of changes since I was last here. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about central banks and inflation. The title, that did central banks cause inflation? The answer, of course, is no, and they certainly didn't want to. It's rather that they didn't prevent inflation, and they have been relatively slow in taking actions to bring inflation back to target. The basic problem was one of failing to forecast what was likely to happen. This is a picture of consecutive forecasts of the Bank of England, showing that they underestimated the strength of inflation throughout. Also note that central banks have a tendency to assume that their policies will always return inflation to target, in this case 2%, at a 2-year horizon. And that this forecast, starting in 2020 when COVID first hit, has been dramatically failed. There is a slight tendency among central banks to argue that the problem is almost entirely Ukraine, and that's not their fault, and nobody could have forecast that. And it's certainly not their fault, and nobody indeed could have forecast that. But look at the line of actual inflation, and you will find it very difficult to see where the Ukraine war actually started. Undoubtedly, Ukraine has made the situation much worse. It's a major supply shock. It has raised inflation further and reduced output considerably. But you can see that the trend of inflation was strictly upwards well before February 2022. So that the sort of the underlying causes of inflation, I would argue, had relatively little to do with Ukraine, though undoubtedly the Ukraine war has worsened everything very considerably. Now, why did central banks fail to forecast, and why did they underestimate the strength and persistence of inflation? Well, I think that you have got to go back to explain what happened before the recent disinflationary past. And we have lived, all of us, in a very unusual period. The last 30 years have seen a greater and more persistent downwards trend in both inflation and in interest rates than has ever occurred before. It's quite unique. And one of the troubles is that human beings tend to be rather myopic and only recall what has actually happened to them personally. And for most people in most markets, they've only lived in this context and don't realize how historically unusual it is. Now, there have been three narratives to explain the disinflationary period that went from about the early 1990s to about 2019-20. The first, and one that is espoused by not only by central bankers but by most mainstream economists, is that this was the result of successful central bank policy, the development of allowing central banks much more independence from political short-term pressures, and the attempt to achieve the inflation target. And there's almost an inevitable tendency for central banks under these circumstances to claim that it's all due to their successful policy. And to some large extent, it actually was. I don't deny it at all. I think that central bank policies have been far better over the last 30 years than they were before. Nevertheless, during the period after the great financial crisis, from 2008-9 until about 2019, the inflation rate in most of our countries fell below the target rate. And although central banks introduced virtually every expansionary policy that they could think of, quantitative easing, forward guidance, the whole sort of line of inflation of expansionary policies, they weren't as a whole able to bring inflation back up to target. This means that at least over the decade prior to COVID, there must have been, and maybe where there were well before, some very strong other disinflationary underlying trends. And there were. And the problem here is that there are two examples of such trends which are radically different in viewpoint and approach, although they come to the same outcome with respect to inflation. The first is that there was a savings glut, to use Ben Bernanke's terminology, secular stagnation, to use Larry Summers' approach. And this was that there was a surplus of savings over investment. Investment was lower, in part because many employers were outsourcing investment, offshoring to China and Asia, that the new areas where investment was taking place, was in IT, where you need human capital rather than real capital, and so on and so on. And at the same time as investment demand in our countries was relatively low, there was an aging population with, over the last 30 years, the bulge of the baby boomers passing through towards retirement, and with the increase in life expectancy, that they were having to save up for a longer retirement. The problem that I think that they face here is that an aging population is transforming into an aged population. And an aged population is one when there are many more old relative to those of working age. And we're moving very swiftly, and is indeed really from 2010, from an aging to an aged population. Another aspect of this exercise that I would like you to be aware of is that dependency ratios in economic terms depend purely on age. And it is frequently said, and correctly said, that if you are relatively healthy at my age, the aged tend to spend less, or the healthy aged tend to spend less than those of working age. We go on fewer holidays, we don't have to buy so many clothes, we tend to stay in the same houses, etc., etc. The problem is that there is an enormous distinction between what you might describe as economic dependency, whether you were retired or young, and medical dependency. And medical dependency is much more age-related than economic dependency. Let me give you some examples from my own country. What really matters is those who are incapacitated and cannot undertake the normal activities of daily living. Demography divides aging up into three categories: young, old, 65, 75, old, 75, 85, and old, of which I'm now a member, 85 plus. If you are in the young, old group, you're actually quite unlikely to become medically dependent. It's 25% of the population in the UK. The old, 75 to 85, it's 50%. The old, it's 75 to 80%. The likelihood is that within 4 or 5 years, I will certainly become incapacitated too. The problem here is that those who are medically incapacitated require an enormous shift of resources to them in the form of drugs, Medicare, for example, and care homes, old age care. And in Japan, which has aged a lot, something like 20% of the workforce is now looking after the aged in that country. And it's a smaller workforce at that. So that the likelihood that the savings ratios will remain as high in future, I think, is actually relatively low. And in particular, this is going to cause a fiscal crisis. Because under present policies, with present policies towards support of the old, if you look at the longer term forecasts of the Congressional Budget Office, Office of Budget Responsibility, and in many other countries, given current forecasts, there are going to be increasing fiscal deficits from here on out. And that means whatever may happen to the rate of growth of nominal incomes relative to the rate of growth of nominal interest rates, Olivier Blanchard's famous R minus G, we are actually facing, under present policies, a debt sustainability issue. And how we deal with that is going to be your problem, because I shall be dead by then. And you're going to have to actually face a world with either much less generosity to the old and higher retirement ages, or a very much higher tax rate. And that isn't going to be particularly popular either. Now, the other argument for the trends that we've had was the labour supply surge, enormous positive supply shock. Because of the baby boomers moving through the working age population, the working age population between 1990 and 2010 increased reasonably fast. More important than that, of the working age population, a growing proportion of women entered into the workforce. When I was young, all those years ago, something like 10 to 15% of married women, that was all who entered the workforce. Now it's over 70%. A combination of contraceptives and consumer durables has completely revolutionized the proportion of women working in the working age population. And then you add globalization, the availability of workers in China, other parts of Asia, Eastern Europe. And if you take all that into account, the working age population available to any employer who could move their production from a high wage to a low wage country more than tripled during 30 years. There has never been any surge in labor force available quite like it in human history. The only sort of equivalent I can think of actually goes the other way, the great plagues of the early medieval. Now, both the demand argument and the supply approach affect inflation similarly, but output very differently. I've been trying to do some work to distinguish between the two, and it won't surprise you that I think that the statistics suggest that the labour surge argument is stronger than the labour demand. The labour demand people, like Olivier Blanchard and the IMF in its recent proposal, believe that once this inflationary period is over, that inflation will go back to being at or below target and interest rates will drop equivalently. Those of us who believe the labour supply shock take a very different view because the decline in the availability of workers is likely to continue and will increase. You've really got to look at the demography developments in China, Russia, Germany, to take only 3 examples. And those in the US and the UK are only held up by immigration, which has its own political problems. Now, let me turn to the current inflationary spike. Again, the causes of the current inflationary spike are arguable. There are those, particularly Olivier Blanchard and to some large extent again Larry Summers, who believe that this was a demand shock, especially with the fiscal policy in the USA and the monetary surges that occurred in much the same period. I should add that I think that Larry Summers is beginning to shift away from this viewpoint. The supply shock, as I've just said, the labour tightening has been widespread and will continue. What I did not, in fact, predict, and was just lucky when I wrote my earlier book about the labour shortages leading to inflationary pressures, was that COVID led to the Great Resignation and to continuing longer periods of ill health, what are known as long COVID. The COVID supply shock and the effect of the deglobalization, the difficulties between the USA and China, and now Ukraine. Whatever reason, central banks were a long way behind the curve. They didn't raise interest rates sufficiently or fast enough. And one of the reasons for that, if you look to see what Jay Powell, for example, was arguing in 2021, is they could see that there was going to be a sharp increase in demand as the vaccines took effect in the autumn of 2021. But they expected this to be offset by a surge in the availability of labor coming back into the labor force. So they didn't expect much in the way of an increase in inflation. Where they were wrong was that they didn't actually foresee the very sharp tightening in labor markets, which actually have continued. Despite interest rates having risen relatively sharply and other difficulties, the labor markets in all our economies remain fairly tight, and are going to go on remaining fairly tight, because the effect of reduction in demand is likely to be offset to some large extent by the continuing adverse effects of demography on the working age population. Let me turn briefly to the inflation in 23-24, current inflation. Where's it going this year? Well, the beneficial factors, energy prices much lower than forecast, and our ability, particularly our ability here in Europe, to cut back on gas, the supply constraints easing, the large monthly increases in inflation after the Ukraine attack are falling out of the annual data. The housing markets in most of our countries have now weakened because of the increase in interest rates, and wage growth is still below inflation. And now I should add the effect of the concern about banking stability, particularly in America, with the problems with Silicon Valley Bank, Signature and the other one, meaning that there's likely to be something of a credit crunch. We don't know how much yet, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about how big that credit reduction will be. Nevertheless, there are adverse effects. China is reopening with an effect on pushing up commodity prices. Labor markets are still tight. And there's going to be a real wage catch-up. Over the last 2 or 3 years, the real wages in many of our economies, certainly my own and in the US, have fallen really quite sharply. Bigger fall in real wages than virtually anywhere else. And people don't understand that and don't want to accept that. So I think there's bound to be some real wage catch-up. And I think that the level of unemployment required to stop people asking for increases in nominal wages sufficient to get back to at least to their pre-COVID levels is going to be unstoppable. Again, particularly in my own countries. And I would say, at any rate so far, the limited effect of interest rate increases on demand. So inflation, I think, overall, will fall in 2023 and fall over the next few months quite sharply as the effect of the Ukraine war and energy prices falls out. But for how long and how far will inflation fall? Now, this is my final slide. I think that the next few decades are going to be dominated by demography, which is largely predictable and heavily adverse, and geopolitics, which is not. There's going to be a falling working age population and rising dependency ratios, particularly among the very old, of whom I'm one of the few representatives in the hall today. Many of you are old enough that you'll be retired fairly soon, but the young, again, the number of people that the young are going to have to support. I take the one-child policy in China. You've got one grandchild to support 4 grandparents, of whom 2 are likely to be incapacitated. And the geopolitics are likely to be adverse, at any rate for the time being. And there are other factors now. Defense spending, because of Ukraine. Climate change. Isabel Schnabel has written some excellent papers on this. Africa is the one area where there's a massive increase in the working age population. Massive. The population of Nigeria by itself is likely to be bigger than the population of the whole of Europe within about 10 or 15 years. Technology could reduce inflation, and medical advances. The best single outcome that would mean that a lot of my worries would be resolved beneficially would be if medicine could find a way to deal with and overcome the neurological diseases that primarily affect the old, by which I mean dementia and Parkinson's and 1 or 2 others. And if that should occur, if medicine may save us, but I do keep an eye on the development of medical abilities to deal with dementia. If this fails, my worries will continue and get worse. If medical advances on neurological diseases are successful, then a lot of my concerns will become much less than they are at the moment. Thank you.